Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Hi, Ro. Great to be back.
Tim, so last week we were waiting with bated breath the announcement of Biden's infrastructure plan. Well, now it's out, and it turns out that it's less of an infrastructure plan and more of a social engineering plan, I think. So what I'm reading is news reports are saying that it's only about 5 to 7% of the spending is for traditional infrastructure, and that a lot of it is about re-engineering the U.S. economy to favor green industries, union jobs, and even more government control.
Yeah, I guess infrastructure is in the eye of the beholder, like a lot in Washington. You know, it's interesting. I don't know how, with a straight face, you can say all of these. You can debate the worthiness of some of the other proposals in the plan, but it's not really infrastructure per se. And it's really a lot more of the kind of subsidies for electric cars and green energy that our Wayne Winegarden has written about before, and has made the case that these are really giveaways to upper income households and the wealthy, that they don't really benefit lower and middle class households. There was a lot of talk in the Trump administration about infrastructure was something that everybody could agree on, and could they get their act together. And I think they were talking something there about, if memory serves, it was, I think, about a $200 billion plan they were talking about then. Well, this is 10 times more expensive, and I don't know, run the numbers. Might the earlier discussions have devoted more money to actual infrastructure than this one?
So a lot of these the provisions in the infrastructure plan favor unions. For example, the package proposes tying federal investments to prevailing wage. It also includes a provision that would require employers who take any money from this plan to be neutral when it comes to union organizing. Plan targets healthcare workers, caregivers. I think there's about $400 billion, and it would be provided through Medicaid. But the plan would make it a lot easier for healthcare workers to unionize, and of course that means more union dues. It's a big payback or a payoff for the unions.
And it's probably one thing where the Biden administration and members of Congress have learned from what's going on in California, because it's been a very common provision of bond-funded school infrastructure projects around the state, whether building new schools or modernizing existing schools. In order for a contractor to get the money, they often have to agree to prevailing wage and a lot of these very pro-union provisions. And as we know, that means higher costs for these projects typically, and less money actually spent on the projects we thought we were funding. Another interesting thing on this whole infrastructure debate is, what kind of money is California going to get? And I thought it was very interesting. There was a great column this week by George Skelton in the LA Times, where he kind of walks through all the money that California is getting from Washington. He notes that we already have about a $20 billion budget surplus. We're going to get about $26 billion for state government in the coronavirus plan, the so-called American Rescue Plan. And then goodness knows how much money we're going to get for various infrastructure projects in this new Biden plan. And he talks about an effort by State Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins to try and spend about $2 billion on what she's calling strategic, non-controversial water infrastructure. Now, the need for a lot of these projects is without question, especially as we have a drought coming up. But the issue with what she's talking about, she's right that she could probably get these things through pretty quickly with this kind of money coming in. But she's looking at more, groundwater, recycling, rebates for making water smart yard landscaping in people's yards. But it doesn't sound like, once again, we're going to have a lot of money for dams, the ultimate water infrastructure need that we still have. We had a water bond in 2014 that was supposed to have key state funding for two water storage projects. It's on the Sites project and the Temperance Flat project, and we're still waiting for those to be built all these years later. So I think what our Steve Greenhut wrote in his book, Winning the Water Wars, is at play here with the kind of thinking here is that Sacramento is more managing scarcity on water infrastructure than promoting abundance, which he talks about in his book.
I'm looking through some of these provisions in the Tony Atkins plan, and it just amazes me that so many of them, and she calls them non-controversial, cleaning up, the drinking water, things like that. Why aren't they being done by regular tax dollars? That we have to wait for money from the spending boon that from the federal government to make this stuff happen. They should have been doing this all along, and that's what drives me crazy.
I agree. You often see too that a lot of this money, we've seen it in before recent moves on transportation, used to see that transportation infrastructure funding was often siphoned off for other needs in the 1990s and in the 2000s until we had more protections for this money put in place by voters. And I think with this, it's kind of the same, is that unless that money is protected in some way, politicians who need a quick buck for something else are going to raid this funding for other more politically popular and more media attention purposes.
Another tranche of money that I think Californians will get a lot of is this whole idea of retraining workers. I think $100 billion is going to that. And it's sort of a sad thing to me, because if you're going to try to engineer and manage the decline of some of our traditional industries like fossil fuels, you're going to throw a lot of people out of jobs, and they will need to be retrained. I can't imagine, say, if Biden had a bill to make it a lot harder for think tanks to survive. I don't know about you, Tim, but I can't imagine going to a local community college to learn how to code or make solar panels. I'll probably just retire early and collect my Social Security, rather than stay in the private economy.
When one of the issues too with the I was reading about the Biden administration, as part of the plan, wants to build a huge array of a massive wind farm along the East Coast. And one of the issues they're having with the building trades unions is that the jobs pay so much less than the current building trades kind of energy jobs today. So yeah, they may have gotten retraining, but that's going to be a huge battle with unions if these jobs are fewer and they pay less money.
The question is, do you think that this infrastructure bill will eventually get passed?
Well, politicians love nothing more than having a big oversized check presentation in their states and districts, and seeing the signs on the highway, this money is brought to you by this bill. I think while individually politicians may have issues, I think the amount of money and the potential that could go to each legislator's individual districts and states, gosh, that's a hard thing to turn down. So I will believe it when I see it, that this bill is turned down, especially if you can push this through, with 50 votes. If you can push this through the Senate with 50 votes, you can almost guarantee it's going to pass, despite whatever misgivings, one senator or another may have about a specific provision. It's just a lot of money to turn down.
Before we depress ourselves further, let's turn to this upcoming podcast, our new podcast, which features PRI Senior Fellow Wayne Winegarden, a new way of analyzing the value of medicine by this organization called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review.
It's an especially important study at a time where it's kind of catching on among different pharmacy groups, and certainly the topic of Congress and the Biden administration are these kind of restrictions on drug spending, and putting in these panels that are going to determine potentially what access that we have to life-saving medication. We don't realize how much access we have to the latest life-saving cures here in the United States versus the rest of the world. So I think it's a very interesting study to learn about, as these issues will be front and center in Washington in the coming months.
Wayne, we're so happy to have you back to discuss your new brief. This one is on the growing popularity of this type of analysis that's used to determine a medicine's value. So to set the stage here, just who is ICER and what do they do?
Thanks, Ro. It's so great to be back here with you guys. ICER, and their full name is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. That's not a vague name, but they're a private organization, and they have a very kind of grandiose, worthy sounding mission, right? Their mission is kind of review the evidence on how much better a new treatment, whether it's a medical device or a medicine, how effective is that treatment at extending or improving patients' lives? And what they do is they go about and they read all of the studies about the new device. They read all of the studies on what the disease is and what all the costs are about the disease and all the different kind of aspects to that. And then they're going to evaluate how effective that medicine is. And then they have these cost effectiveness models, these value models. And so they're going to bring that all together in their black box and come up with a price. And that price allegedly, I emphasize allegedly, conveys the value of the drug or the medical device.
So the first paper in your 3-part series, which is called Quantifying the Wrong Value, and anyone who's interested in reading more, downloading the papers, they can go to our CMEI website, which is medecon.org. So the first paper is called Inherently Flawed, and it points out some of the key flaws in how ICER determines a medication's value. So I thought it'd be good if we went through some of these. So first, you note that ICER doesn't use clinical trials or even treat patients. So how can they come up with a drug's value if they don't see any patients?
I guess the short answer is they can't. Is their next question. The long answer is that ICER wants to be what's NICE in the UK. NICE stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And NICE creates price controls in England. When you talk about price controls in other countries, this is the methodology they use to cap the prices of medicine. So this is, that step in socialized medicine, that step in single, all of, these kind of things that we're going toward, unfortunately. ICER is an important part of it. So you're saying, how do they come up with the drug's value? Well, they're not actually coming up with the drug's value. What they're doing is they're using all of these fancy models and complicated procedures, and then they're summarizing the impacts, and they're taking it to their economic models, and they're running a very complex computer model. And then based on all the assumptions they plug in, voila, you have a cost effectiveness price. And I always imagine like a mad scientist kind of at one end of a machine and jamming things into one end, and at the other end comes out the price. And, essentially that's what they're doing, but they're not seeing patients. They're not running clinical trials. So they're just this third party that thinks that value comes from some mathematical equation from up on high, and that they have discovered that mathematical equation.
You also write that ICER bases a lot of its value analysis on populations. So how do they do this, and why do you think it's a bad idea?
Well, it's a bad idea, because medicine's always been a personalized issue, right? And it's even becoming more so. It's one of the ironies that I don't think ICER sees or NICE, they don't see either, that as the technology for medicine is becoming more and more personalized, as we're understanding the DNA, mRNA vaccines, right? Pfizer and Moderna for COVID. All of this kind of personalized, really getting into our genetic structure. And now we're going to value medicine based on averages, because that's what they're essentially doing when they're running these numbers. They're just using what the population averages are, but people are going to differ. Some medicines are actually meant for part of the population where the current medicine doesn't work well, or that they have allergies, or they have reactions to certain medicine. If you have an allergy to penicillin, right, then obviously what the average response to penicillin, it's irrelevant for you, because what matters is your individual needs, different circumstances we have in life. And none of that can be accounted for when you're doing population perspective, basing on the average. And one of the things we do in the paper is apply this to any other product, apply it to a car. How can you value a car when on an average price, when the attributes we need vary so much? So the entire premise of what they're trying to do is really depersonalizing medicine at a time where that's exactly what the technology takes us.
Another thing that you cover in your study is that ICER evaluates the cost effectiveness of a medication before all the clinical trial data and real world anecdotes are available. So why is it so important to have this information on hand before determining value, and how are ICER's figures or determinations flawed without it?
Well, they're flawed without it because the value emerges from real world use, right? I mean, that's how value comes about. But from a scientific perspective, even the FDA states it's on their own websites that there's only so much information you can have about a medicine when you're at the clinical trial stage. It's just not possible to know everything, especially because the clinical trials are controlled. So lots of issues in the real world are going to come up that won't necessarily come up in a clinical trial. As you get it out to more people, you're going to learn things, some positive, some negative, different types of uses will come about. That's kind of that scientific process where things evolve over time, we learn over time. And so you just don't have all that information at the clinical trial stage. Now, mind you, some of ICER studies are run when they're in still phase 2, not even yet in phase 3 trials. Phase 3 being kind of that broad-based trial right before you get your approval. So you're just basing this before we have all the information. It's almost as if you're trying to base who's going to win March Madness before they've even set the brackets. You're just kind of looking at how the season went, and that's just not enough information. It gives you a sense of kind of where your bracket should be. March Madness, that's this time of year, right? But you never know. There's always upsets. You never know how the madness will go about. It's the same thing, right? Before you actually get the drug into broad-based use, there's a lot of information you just don't have. And to establish your value, that's the big thing I think we have to remember. When they set a value, you're capping the price. And if you set that too low, now all of a sudden you're impacting people's access negatively. And you're also now just discouraging any further innovation in that space because people are going to know I can't get my money out. It's going to spend all my research, and we're paying all these controlled prices. So there's a real danger, and I think that's important to emphasize. There's a real danger that arises because of shortages and access issues.
Yeah, Wayne, another good example of that is the coronavirus vaccine that's distributed right now, that scientists and medical professionals are still learning about the coronavirus and what the vaccines can actually do and not do. So we're vaccinating, millions of people, and yet all the information isn't there. So I can see your point. It's very important. You also talk about the subjectivity of ICER's analysis. So what are some of these biases that go into their work, and how does it determine the legitimacy and accuracy of their value determination?
I think now we're getting into some of the heart of their problems and their subjectivity, as you said, which is exactly right. Take one of the assumptions. They have an assumption. They create a budget cap. So they basically say that the amount we should be spending on drugs should be no greater than the increases in that, should be no greater than the growth in GDP, right? The growth in the economy, plus 1 percentage point. Why plus 1 percentage point? I'm guessing because it's less than 2, but it's greater than 0. Why GDP? Well, that seems to be, how much we can afford to pay. But it's a completely arbitrary assumption. I mean, perhaps with an aging population, it should be GDP plus 2, or maybe with technologies, it should be, 5 percentage points below GDP. I mean, that's just a subjective belief that's kind of grown up around this cost effectiveness industry. ICER is not the only one that would do this, but they're the biggest perpetrator, if I can use that term, in the US, that is a relevant figure. If I have a brand new innovative drug and I bring it out during a recession, does that mean it's worth less? What if I have just an adequate drug, but I bring it out in time where times are booming? Does that mean, it just seems completely irrelevant to what the value of the drug is. And that's kind of, again, the undermining, because the value of the product is going to be the demand side considerations, right? How efficacious is the drug? What type of adverse health consequences does the drug have? What's the adverse consequences of the disease? How much of an impact does the disease have on a quality of life? And that's a completely subjective kind of assessment, right? In terms of how much somebody's life is impacted by this disease. And then you also have supply side considerations, right? What's the manufacturer's cost of capital? How difficult was it to bring this medicine from idea to the lab to actually being available to the patient? And so, those are the fundamental drivers, and they have nothing to do with this subjective budget constraint that ICER has determined is the right amount that expenditure should grow. And even if it is the right amount, they never get into the idea that, well, how do we know that this isn't a higher value use of this spending compared to lots of the other things we're already spending on? Maybe if their budget constraint was correct, which is not, maybe with this new drug that comes on the market, some other spending is what should get this short shrift, because this is more important. I mean, they don't take into account any of these considerations. So basically, it's just a fancy way of saying that there's a suggested price control on any new drug that comes on the market.
One key point in your study is that ICER's analyses practically ignore the value that individual patients place on having good health and in the medications that keep them healthy. Can you give a few examples of this?
Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, one of the most awful things about their studies. I take pain, right, which is something I think we all can, relate to, really bad headache, or people who are living with migraines, right? And especially if you're living with chronic migraine, that there's a threshold, I think it's about 15 a month. If you've crossed that, you're actually considered to be chronic migraine, something around that level. I mean, that is a crippling disease that you're living with, right? It's not just the pain. It's kind of the robbing of your life that, you can't be with your family, you can't work, because when the migraine hits, you have to go into a dark room and just close your eyes and just wait it out. It's awful. Now, how do you value that, right? And ICER's methodology, by definition, undervalues medicines that reduce pain, because again, the quantification of that, it undervalues if I need care. So my wife or my children can't work, or they have to work less. How do you value that? And again, there's subjective kind of assumptions that they make, but it's just it's not relevant for an individual patient, and it doesn't encompass all of these other costs. I mean, imagine we had a medication that got rid of chronic migraines, or got rid of migraines completely. Now you're back to work and your productivity is better. Well, those values aren't included, or your kids can go to school. So, I mean, these are all just examples of the inability for ICER to be able to incorporate all of the essential parts of what we talk about in good health, because so much of it is subjective. And we haven't even talked about, and I mentioned this in the paper, of diseases like tardive dyskinesia. That's a condition that typically follows people who are taking drugs that manage psychosis, schizophrenia, things of that nature. But tardive dyskinesia, that condition, it causes repetitive involuntary movements of the face and contortion. I mean, if you're having that in public, and now we can control that, what's the value? And, again, putting an organization being able to put a dollar value and tell you what it's worth so your face doesn't contort uncontrollably in public, it's one, a little offensive, but two, it's just, you can't imagine how somebody can do that accurately.
Yeah, Wayne, and I think of the other end of that, which is end of life care and end of life pain management. And, what does it mean if you're valuing that pain medication based on the length of someone's life? I think that would be very sad if that analysis was used to judge these pain medications.
Oh, absolutely. And then, and they do judge things on this nature, but what's the value of somebody at end of life versus some young person in their 20s? I mean, to be doing those types of trade-offs, it's awful.
So when you also write about this analysis called QALY to determine a medicine's cost effectiveness. Now, I think, it sort of sounds like quality to me, QALY, so that already makes me nervous. So what is QALY and how does it contribute to a flawed bias or analysis?
Oh my God, Rory, you are 100%. It never occurred to me in all the years I've been doing this, but I think you're 100% correct. I think it's supposed to give you this idea of quality. I don't know why it never occurred to me. You are, I think, 100% correct. Now, and this is the essence of the death panels. This is the essence of price controls. I mean, we're kind of really in the heart of the beast here when you're talking about QALYs. QALYs is quality adjusted life year. So we're talking about cost per quality adjusted life year to measure effectiveness. And essentially what ICER says, and again, they're not the only one that uses this, is in the cost effectiveness kind of industry, I'm going to use that term. It's a very common kind of metric to use. It's an awful and it's wrong and it's inapplicable to people. But they'll say that 1 year of life in perfect health, or to gain 1 year of life in perfect health, we are willing to spend between $100,000 and $150,000. So we now have a value of one additional year in perfect health. It's somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. Now that we know what 1 year of life in perfect health is, then all we need to do is figure out, well, how much does this medicine kind of improve someone's life and what type of health is somebody in? So if you're living pain-free in perfect health, you get a value of 1, but if you have pain, then maybe your quality would be equal to 0.5. So now we have a medicine that has a certain amount of effectiveness in terms of whether it's keeping you healthy, addressing cancer, heart disease, reducing pain, whatever, arthritis, whatever the condition, we now know have an effectiveness of that medicine. So with that effectiveness, you can then figure out how much it's going to increase the quality. And we know that you'll pay $100,000 per increase. So if we get a 0.25% increase in your, 0.25 increase in your quality, and we know that's worth $25,000. So a drug that can increase by 0.25 over quality, the cost effectiveness would be $25,000. I've simplified it tremendously, but essentially that's what you're talking about. And of course, the problem is exactly what we were just talking about. How do you define what one life year in perfect health is? And there's, to me, obviously, ethical problems of granting any centralized organization, but let alone this private organization, to define what one life year in perfect health is worth. And again, that value is a completely arbitrary assumption. But when you start getting into these orphan drugs, for instance, I also say these instances of like orphan drugs. An orphan drug is a drug that treats a rare disease, which means very few people are living with this disease, which, because the costs of development don't go down, those medicines are going to be more expensive. So you have a bias against medicines that treat people with fewer diseases because the cost of that medicine is going to be more likely above that threshold we just talked about. Or if you're not valuing lots of the benefits, which often ICER studies do not, then you're keeping out a lot of the benefits when you're estimating this. And so you're going to underestimate the value of the drug, and it's going to seem as if, you're not adding value when in fact you are. It's just that their methodology is incapable of picking it up.
Aside from your study, drug pricing continues to be a hot issue in Washington. Speaker Pelosi and House Democrats have several drug pricing related measures that are reportedly going to be fast-tracked through the House this spring. So what are some of these proposals, and what impact do you think these new government mandates would have on innovation, accessibility, and affordability if they were enacted?
The proposals that they're thinking about are all going in the wrong direction. I mean, there's different variations, but essentially, whether it's giving the power to Medicare to negotiate with private companies or just coming out directly with a price control or importation, it's all some variation off of the price control theme. Basically, Speaker Pelosi and House Democrats believe that only government and single payer can save the healthcare system. And so essentially, whatever they're discussing, however they kind of frame it, what they're talking about in practice are price controls. And what price controls are going to do, and you see these impacts in Canada and Europe and all the other countries that impose these price controls, it's going to decrease innovation. It's going to decrease accessibility to medicines. We'll have less access to medicines. And ironically, and this is, I think, the most important part, it's not going to address the problem of healthcare affordability. And that's essential. You will, if you impose price controls on drugs, you will lower the cost of those drugs. That's inevitably what will happen. But it's the secondary and tertiary impacts where you're actually going to see overall healthcare spending could increase. By imposing these controls, you're going to reduce people's access to medicines. The perfect way of seeing that is in the US, we have access to about 90% of all the new medicines over the past 10 or 15 years. The next highest country is Germany, where they have access to 2/3 of those medicines. In Canada, you have access to less than half. So you're going to see us have less access to medicines. You also see less innovation being driven by those countries. And part of the way you can see that is, 30, 40 years ago, Europe was really the center of drug development. But because of the price controls and the fact that the US has been driving the market, much of that kind of really high-tech beneficial industry has migrated to the US. Now, that's been obviously good for the US economy, but that gives you a sense of the impact on innovation that price controls have. When you can't cover your cost of capital, people aren't going to give you more capital to invest. It seems pretty obvious, right? That if I could invest in Apple and make money, or invest in a pharma company and lose money, I'm going to invest in Apple. So you're going to lose the resources we need to innovate to address problems like Alzheimer's, where we don't actually have a treatment for that yet. We're getting close, but if you impose price controls, you're going to make it less likely that we have that innovation. All of that less innovation, all of that less access means that diseases that could be controlled through medicines are now, you need other type of medical interventions. Those often, especially because they could be later on when problems are more serious. Imagine not being able to take your cholesterol medication. Statins are real cheap. If you didn't have access to those, not that those are threatened, but just as an example, then you're going to have more heart disease, right? Well, now with more surgeries, more care in the hospital, costs are going to go up. That process, it's obviously not that clear with respect to the generic statins, but that process is what we're going to see if we allow these price controls to be implemented, where you're going to not actually increase affordability because spending in hospitals, spending with doctors, spending in other part of the healthcare system, which is, by the way, 85% of where the expenditures are. Only 15% is in drugs and biopharmaceuticals. You're going to see that 85% increase. And so overall healthcare spending will go up, even though the spending on drugs would go down. So it's a really counterproductive measure as well.
Finally, Wayne, your future papers in this whole Quantifying the Wrong Value series will outline alternative ways to actually calculate medication's value without the flawed approach that ICER is using. Give our listeners a preview. What is a better, more market-based way to determine a medication's value?
Well, I think that's exactly it, a market-based way. One of the things that took me a long time to fully understand, because as an economist, we're trained to understand that prices reflect value. And so when people kept talking about value-based pricing for healthcare, it naturally doesn't make sense to me, because pricing is value-based. But the problem is that the way our insurance system works and the way kind of healthcare has evolved with all of the third-party payers and all of the disincentives, we've actually created this artificial separation between price and value. And that's the problem, right? So ICER, they have identified, and I think we should recognize that they have identified an important problem, because prices have been separated from value, and that's never a good thing. The problem of this approach, obviously, is that you don't get to determine value from upon high. So what you need is to fix the disincentives of the system so that we can actually create a system where that value can be discovered. And so that's kind of in the next piece, what we really want to do is identify how the prices and values have been separated and how through a market kind of based system where the incentives are aligned, we could bring those two concepts back together as they should be so that we actually would have a more efficient system that promotes innovation and affordability, which is the sine qua non of the entire process. And then in the third paper, we want to extend this to what some of the most exciting therapies are right now, which is called gene and cell therapies, which are actually much more like organ transplants than actual drugs. But they're using these to treat, diseases and essentially cure diseases that like spinal muscular atrophy, where it's a disease that up until now, it afflicts babies, and over 10, 15 years, these children will die. We now, thanks to gene and cell therapies, we can cure them. And we're not, there yet on lots of other areas, but that's an emerging therapy area. It's incredibly exciting, its possibilities for cures, but it's incredibly expensive because you're actually changing somebody's DNA structure. And, I guess that's not something you want to go bargain on when you're changing your DNA, but we need to address the payment system so we can keep up with that. And so those are the issues we'll take on in the third paper. And what we hope to have done is in this paper say why you can't determine value upon high, and then in the next two come up with and describe the policy reforms so that through the market process, value will be naturally emerging, which would be a much more effective system and a system that promotes both innovation and affordability.
Thanks so much, Wayne. It's a great study and again, available on our website. But, I wanted to let listeners know that if you want to get a 3-minute version of this study, we've also done a video on our website, and it's also going to be available on the YouTube page. Tim and Wayne do a great job distilling complicated information into a very substantive video. And it's clever and it's very informative. So please take a look at that if you want a video version. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.